Throughout its run, the Xbox One was subject to a string of high-profile game cancellations. Projects like Phantom Dust, Fable Legends, and Scalebound were the source of some anguish for fans, but there was another lost first-party title left overshadowed that generation. At Microsoft's E3 2013 conference, where they unveiled the console's lineup, the publisher teased a game from an up-and-coming new subsidiary of theirs named Black Tusk Studios. On stage, Microsoft's Phil Spencer said that they were assembling a world-class team to build a AAA first-party game exclusively for Xbox One, before showing off a quick teaser of what was to come. This video, just over 30 seconds long, offered only a brief glimpse at a mysterious new spy game being built in Unreal Engine 4. In the end, the reveal was obscured by a combination of hype around other games announced in that same show, like Titanfall, and a flood of negative publicity directed towards the console's DRM policies. That short teaser, however, would be all the public were ever shown by Microsoft of what Black Tusk had been working on. All that remained was scant rumours about the project's identity, such as one insider claiming that it was codenamed Shangheist. As a result, it would commonly be referred to by this name in the years since, despite any confirmation on that from the developers themselves. The project was later downplayed by Phil Spencer, who told Polygon that it was more of a concept piece, and that the studio has really been incubating different ideas over the past 6 to 9 months on what they might work on. These statements would lead many to believe that it wasn't indicative of an actual game the developers were working on or ever intended to produce. Years later, many questions around the project have remained unanswered. What really was it intended to be? Was it truly just a concept piece? Was Black Tusk as non-committal towards it as Phil Spencer suggested? Speaking to former members of the studio, I immersed myself in its history in an effort to find out. The company that would later be known as Black Tusk was originally founded in February 2010 as Zipline Studios, a small subsidiary of Microsoft based in Vancouver, Canada. In its original incarnation, it was set up to produce games for social and mobile platforms as part of a Microsoft push to break into the casual game market. In 2011, it launched its debut title, a Facebook puzzle game named Relic Rescue. Its time operating under the moniker of Zipline was cut short, however. According to former employees, Microsoft encountered a naming conflict with an unrelated mobile game studio in Seattle called Zipline Games, forcing them to change it. This clash coincided with a shifting of priorities among Microsoft's leadership, enabling them to capitalize upon the situation. They were looking to create more games for the Xbox 360's new motion sensing peripheral, the Kinect, which launched several months earlier. Taking into account their experience with casual games, the higher-ups chose to expand Zipline and tasked them with developing multiple original titles built around the device. Although casual games were no longer to be the studio's primary focus, Microsoft also envisioned them producing core games for Kinect aimed at more experienced players. To that end, they were given the assignment of developing a brand new Halo game with the Kinect at its center. In 2010, its original developers Bungie bid farewell to the franchise with their swan song Halo Reach, but Microsoft had no intention of letting it stay on ice for long. While 343 Industries worked on its next major installment, Halo 4, the crew at Zipline was intended to produce a Kinect spin-off set in that same universe. To mark this radical change of course, the company was renamed to Microsoft Game Studios Vancouver. They began staffing up for work on the proposed Halo game and an original title aimed at a much younger audience. Microsoft had entered a partnership with Sesame Workshop, the organization behind the Sesame Street TV show, to make Kinect games featuring their characters. The first of these was being made by Double Fine, written by Tim Schafer, which was called Sesame Street Once Upon a Monster. This was to be followed up in 2012 by a game in the works at Soho Productions titled Kinect Sesame Street TV, and a third project from Microsoft Vancouver. The team in Vancouver was being presided over by lead designer Tyler Bielman, who would later serve as a senior game designer on Gears of War 4. Codenamed Project Columbia, their game aimed to teach children the joys of reading by inserting them into its storybook worlds via augmented reality. They could interact with the words and illustrations within, motioning their arms and legs to progress through its various stories. Project Columbia was formally announced in a Microsoft press release on the 18th of October 2011, although this would be the only update on it issued to the public before it was swept up in another shakeup for the developers. In the first months of 2012, Microsoft sent out a briefing to some of its studios and partners, soliciting pitches for a new IP in the third-person action-adventure game genre. The publisher had been preparing the lineup for its next-generation console, then codenamed Durango, and had identified a gap in their portfolio for such a game. In essence, Microsoft had recognized that the Xbox needed its answer to Sony's Uncharted series, a briskly paced third-person shooter big on action set-pieces. Just several months prior to this, in November 2011, Uncharted 3 had launched to commercial success and became one of the best-reviewed games of the year. According to former developers, Microsoft Vancouver was among those who received this briefing. A small group of the company believed that the studio could deliver on what Microsoft was looking for, and put together a pitch for such a game. This team was led by Chuck O'Shea, a game industry veteran of many years, who started his career at Blue Sky Software, where he worked on the original Vector Man. He went on to become a producer at EA Sports on the Need for Speed series before joining Microsoft in 2009, where he served as a creative director. Previously, O'Shea had been involved in making various games for Windows like Age of Empires Online and more recently Microsoft Flight. With the latter game now finished and readying for release, he and other developers put forward their proposal for a new IP. In short, the idea for this game was Uncharted with Spies, an action-packed third-person shooter where the player controlled secret agents on high-octane espionage missions in various cities around the world. During early discussions around this project, Kinect implementation of some kind was under consideration, although the primary inputs were intended to be handled using a conventional controller. For Microsoft's executives, the pitch aligned well with their interests. It would give them a new third-person shooter in the vein of Uncharted, while providing another reason to justify the existence of the Xbox One's Kinect. This was planned to be a major part of the next console, being bundled with it from day one. They decided to move forward with this new project, which was given the codename of Ranger, not Shanghaiized as had previously been rumoured. What followed this decision was further upheaval for the studio that had been quietly staffing up to develop a Halo Kinect title in the months leading up to this. Before a plan for the game had solidified, Microsoft deemed that development on it would no longer proceed in February 2012. Their resources would instead be devoted to Project Ranger. Some staff were let go as contracts were cancelled, while others found themselves reallocated onto this new endeavour. Due to its premature end, details on the nature of their Kinect Halo game are sparse. Developers told me that it was aiming to be true to the series, a shooter game of some sort with a multiplayer component, but little progress had been made towards realising it. In its absence, the closest Microsoft would come to a Halo Kinect game would be the Kinect library features in 2011's Halo Combat Evolved Anniversary, where players could scan elements of their environment, such as creatures, a la Metroid Prime. The Vancouver branch instead started gearing up for pre-production on Ranger in spring 2012. As their first AAA project, it was set to be their biggest undertaking yet by some margin, demanding a significant expansion of their workforce. The hiring process for Ranger kicked off amid a climate of instability for the Vancouver game development scene. 2012 saw layoffs across a range of different studios in the city, including EA Vancouver, Capcom Vancouver, and Relic Entertainment. Ubisoft shut down its Vancouver arm altogether towards the start of the year, and in June, Radical Entertainment was closed by Activision after their last game, Prototype 2, fell short of their expectations. Just days later, Rockstar dissolved their Vancouver wing, merging it with Rockstar Toronto. This meant that Microsoft Vancouver was uniquely positioned to pick up a lot of this seasoned industry talent for themselves. Alongside this, they were recruiting the help of students and educators from the Savannah College of Art and Design, with whom Microsoft frequently collaborated. As part of their courses, SCAD arranged placements for a small group of design and art students to work directly with Microsoft on Ranger. They were being overseen by Jack Mamias, a SCAD professor who had previously served as lead designer on Far Cry and Crysis. I spoke with people connected to the scheme who compared it to an unpaid internship. Students were not compensated for their work on the project and participated mostly in the hope of bolstering their employment prospects and or being hired by Microsoft. Here's what one former student had to say about why they agreed to be a part of it. Quote, "It seemed like a great opportunity at the time to add a Microsoft game project to my resume right before graduating, thinking it would help my chances in getting a job in the game industry fresh out of college." End quote. The student team worked closely with the developers to flesh out some of their ideas during early pre-production. In particular, Microsoft wanted them to map out concepts for how their next generation Kinect could be utilized during gameplay. They were told that the game would use conventional button controls for key inputs like movement and shooting, but they had aspirations of layering Kinect on top of this to enhance the experience. How exactly this would be achieved had yet to be determined, and it was left largely to the SCAD group to explore. Those involved at the time say that SCAD's educators and students were given limited direction by Microsoft and their developers, which some told me they found to be an impediment. Quote, "I thought the design space they gave us was very limited. This was due to the lack of information given to us about the gameplay. It was difficult to come up with anything that was more convenient than just simply hitting a button on your controller to switch out a weapon add-on. The lack of information at this stage was partly due to the high level of secrecy around the project, but also the fact that many of the specifics had yet to be settled upon, and wouldn't be for months to come. They were told that the core concept of Ranger was Mission Impossible meets Uncharted, a game blending the duck and cover action shooting and set pieces of Uncharted with the spy missions and aesthetics of the Mission Impossible film franchise. In service of helping them realize this, they were instructed to watch the two most recent films in the series at the time for inspiration, which were Mission Impossible 3 and Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol. Microsoft Vancouver had even cut together a Rippermatic video using clips from the movies to demonstrate the style and tone they were trying to emulate. The developers also provided details of the game's plot as it was starting to take shape. This story followed dual protagonists, Cole and Jenna, two spies working for a top-secret organization named Cobalt. Highly trained and armed with cutting-edge gadgetry, they must embark on a series of daring missions around the globe in pursuit of a shadowy terrorist group that threatens world peace. According to an artist who worked on the project, the team intended for players to control each of them at different points throughout the story as they undertook separate missions. Despite their aspiration of eventually having two playable leads, it was Cole that would remain the team's focus throughout. He would be the only playable character featured in their prototypes as they concentrated on cracking the core gameplay loop. At this point in development, it was being envisioned by the developers that gadgets would play a major role in the game, being used throughout missions to distract and neutralize hostiles. As such, the SCAD students were assigned with conceptualizing many of the game's high-tech tools, such as the Electronic Communications Hacking Prototype 0, or ECHO. Disguised as a box of chewing gum, this was a device that could learn the voice of an NPC and then replicate it, hacking into enemy radios or computers to relay false orders and manipulate them. There was the Flying Logistics Indicator, or FLY, a small drone with the appearance of a dragonfly or wasp that players would have controlled directly, guiding it through the air. By landing it on appliances like cameras and turrets, players could assume control of them to mislead and eliminate enemies. Both of these gadgets, and others, were designed with the game's targeted Kinect functionality in mind. It was imagined that they could be summoned and tweaked on the fly via an elaborate voice control system being called VUI, short for Voice User Interface. For instance, Cole came equipped with a high-tech handgun called the Auxiliary Multiple Munitions Prototype 0, or AMMO, that the player could customize based upon their situation. By speaking into the Kinect, it was intended that players could cause the gun to transform in Cole's hands, adapting it to the task at hand. Saying Ammo Stun, for example, could set it to equip non-lethal darts that incapacitate targets with an electric charge. Other options included explosive bullets and armor-piercing rounds. The other major facet of the voice user interface specified that the player, as Cole, could communicate with his handler. During missions, Cole would be aided by another agent called Sam, who operates remotely, keeping in touch with him over a headset. Working from behind a desk, Sam would be able to provide up-to-date intel and use the considerable resources at her fingertips to assist him. The developers scoped out the idea of having players talk to her both in menus and during gameplay. Many possibilities were etched out for this feature, such as the player being able to request extra information from her on specific hostiles and locations. She would be able to monitor Cole's progress through his Tactical Ocular Interface, or TOI, a highly advanced set of contact lenses. This gizmo granted Cole, and by extension the player, extra levels of perception, allowing them to get the drop on enemies. They could see people through walls using its infrared setting, view NPC vitals in X-ray mode, or operate in the dark with its night vision capabilities. As per their assignment, the students proposed that these features could be toggled in real time through voice commands. The toy not only explained why Sam was able to keep up with Cole's movements, it gave an in-universe context for the HUD visible to players during gameplay. The developers discussed enabling players to heavily customize the HUD via voice control, adjusting it on the fly to their liking by adding or removing relevant information. As well as being a handy implement during combat, the toy was pitched as being useful during interrogations. One scenario drafted out, imagine Cole monitoring a subject's heartbeat to determine the truthfulness of their responses, or trying to stop short of sending them into cardiac arrest as he tortures the information out of them. During this ideation phase, the developers were scoping out concepts for online multiplayer modes as well. One of these, worked on by the SCAD group, proposed 2 teams of spies competing to accomplish an objective. One member of each team would play the role of the handler, who would manipulate the environment by hacking elements of it and feeding useful information back to their teammates. Another take on the same mode suggested having a team of player-controlled spies go up against a team of AI guards. The players would have to stage a jailbreak and extract a person of interest while the CPU faction attempted to stop them. These bots would be managed by a lone player called the Overwatcher, who would issue orders to them through voice commands. For example, they could equip specific guards with different weapons, tell them to adopt different tactics like forming a defensive line or being more aggressive, ask them to move prisoners to other cell blocks, or lock doors to prevent the agent team from progressing. Intricate ideas such as these formed over the summer of 2012 as SCAD collaborated with the developers, although many of those wouldn't make it far past the drawing board. In July 2012, the SCAD group presented their work to a Microsoft panel, according to sources privy to the process. Since Sam played such a huge role as the character they imagined the player would speak to via Kinect, SCAD brought in an acting student to portray her for their presentation. This placeholder actor recorded a myriad of short videos to showcase some of the potential interactions players could have with her and the information she could provide.
Based on your performance the last time you were active, I'd suggest working on your marksmanship.
One person from the group recalled how this slideshow was received. Quote, "At the end of the semester, we gave a presentation to the dev team at Microsoft, and they seemed pretty unimpressed with it, almost as if they had already thought of all the concepts/designs we had come up with. They provided very little input after we had finished presenting, and just seemed like they were checked out and ready for it to be over. In all honesty, it wasn't a very great experience working with them, and if I could do it all over again, I would have just opted to work on my own game project, which we had the option to do." Another source, on the other hand, did provide a more positive account of events, claiming that Microsoft did show interest in some of the ideas they had laid out. Nonetheless, as time went on, Microsoft Vancouver abandoned their plans for multiplayer and put their ambitions of implementing Kinect on the back burner. With the developers trying not to overextend their ambitions, Project Ranger narrowed its focus to a more traditional linear narrative-driven single-player experience. Some sources believe that this would be a change for the better. Quote, "It was almost as if the dev team was given a requirement by Microsoft to find a way to incorporate Kinect, and they sort of had to design backwards from there. Instead of coming up with hardware to solve a design problem, we were coming up with designs to solve a hardware is not selling enough problem." A number of ex-employees have claimed that in the following months, conversations about utilizing Kinect for UI customization and speaking to a handler character persisted, but none of these concepts ever reached the prototyping phase. Microsoft's execs were not opposed to this, as even their enthusiasm for the device waned over time. Some of what the SCAD team had envisioned did live on, however, such as the various gadgets the students had conceived of, like Cole's transforming handgun, his futuristic contact lenses, and the small drone he could deploy to sabotage enemy bases. Sam, the character who would advise Cole throughout missions, was carried forward too. One developer explained that this decision was made since Sam provided an effective way to drive narrative and game design forward. Around this time, a rough backstory for the character had been drafted out that she was a former field agent in her late 20s who had reluctantly taken on a desk job following an injury. Full name Samantha Cass, she was originally from Hong Kong but had migrated to the UK at a young age, where she was trained under MI6. She would provide distance support for both Cole and Jenna, and together they would make up the task force designated Bravo team by Cobalt. Towards the end of July 2012, work on Ranger continued to ramp up. Following their collaboration with the Savannah College of Art and Design, the project's ideas had been fleshed out and prototyping was underway. Microsoft's heads gave them the go-ahead to proceed, which would spell yet more big changes for the subsidiary. According to sources who were present around this time, some staff had expressed their disapproval of the more casual projects that the Vancouver studio had been undertaking, believing that they were antithetical to the identity they were trying to establish for themselves as a maker of core games. In order to reinvent themselves effectively, these people suggested renaming the company again and moving away from the kinds of titles they had previously been responsible for. On the 25th of July 2012, Microsoft higher-ups granted them their wish. They cancelled Project Columbia, the Kinect reading game being made in partnership with Sesame Workshop, and ended post-launch support for Microsoft Flight, which Microsoft Vancouver had been contributing to. All 35 employees on these projects, all of those who were not a part of Ranger, were laid off abruptly. In the following months, the company would be rebranded to Black Tusk Studios. According to people involved in this process, they said that Black Tusk was intended to sound tougher and edgier, reinforcing their new identity as a producer of mature AAA games. The name was derived from the Black Tusk Mountain located in British Columbia, the same province that the studio itself was based in. In keeping with this, the different facilities throughout the Black Tusk offices, such as the conference rooms, would become named after various mountain and skiing related terms. By late 2012, they'd assembled some early tests for Ranger in Unreal Engine 4. The team was growing steadily, at which point Black Tusk announced itself to the world on the 29th of November 2012. The studio's manager, Mike Crump, gave an interview to the Vancouver Sun in which he spoke about their project publicly for the first time. Quote, "Studio staff have an average of 12 years experience in AAA games, the industry's equivalent of Hollywood summer blockbuster movies. Big games, big teams, big budgets, long timelines. What that means is we are working on Microsoft's next big entertainment franchise. We're not working on an existing franchise, we're looking to build the next Halo here in Vancouver, which is really exciting. We are building something from the ground up." The studio had by then expanded to 55 workers, and according to Mike Crump, they intended to double their numbers over the next year. In early 2013, Microsoft started preparing to reveal the Xbox One's lineup of games at E3 in June. For that event, they had Black Tusk create a teaser that would establish the studio in the minds of audiences and offer a glimpse at the game they were working on. Using Unreal Engine 4, a team of theirs produced a detailed 30-second teaser showing Agent Cole abseiling down the side of a Shanghai skyscraper on the night of the Lunar New Year celebrations. As Cole descends the tower, fireworks boom around him, creating cover for him to break in and knock out an unsuspecting guard. This sequence was based upon a key level planned for the game where terrorists would occupy an unfinished office tower in Shanghai. Cole would have to infiltrate it and dispatch them with either melee takedowns or by engaging them in a gunfight. As the situation escalates, parts of the building still under construction would be compromised, leading to a perilous set piece where he would leap between sections of scaffolding. Black Tusk's teaser was heavily influenced by a scene from Mission Impossible 3, in which Tom Cruise's Ethan Hunt leaps off a tower in Shanghai and swings between buildings using a wire. Even Cole's short dark hair and black stealth suit borrowed from Cruise's look in the film. The trailer also showcased a number of the contributions that students from the Savannah College of Art and Design had made to the project back in 2012. For example, Cole's contact lenses could be momentarily seen as they scan his environment. The video ends with a zoom in on Cole squeezing the trigger on his handgun, causing its high-tech internals to shift around before it fires. This teased the weapon's ability to transform and adapt to situations, as the SCUD team had once outlined. According to two of the students who had worked on Ranger in the previous year, they were given informal assurances by Microsoft's developers that they would be offered jobs as it advanced. Despite the fruits of their unpaid work making it into this teaser, these alleged promises were never followed up on. Following E3 2013, the project came around to defining the character of Cole more closely. He was an American super spy with a cocksure attitude who was equal parts charismatic and deadly. Charming yet capable, he was another example of the game's evident Uncharted inspiration, lending from its protagonist Nathan Drake. Soon, the voice of Cole was found in Liam McIntyre, an up-and-coming actor from Australia who had risen to prominence after playing the title role in the TV show Spartacus. Former workers told me that McIntyre was already a fan of video games when he was approached and enthusiastically agreed to come on board. For his part in Ranger, he adopted an American accent and gave his likeness to the character, for which Microsoft forked out an apparently hefty sum. He portrayed Cole not only with his voice, but during performance and motion capture filming. Consequently, future designs for Cole adopted McIntyre's likeness, replacing the dark-haired version of him seen in the E3 trailer. Another actor to sign on to the project was Alex Ponovich, who would later appear in the 2016 Van Helsing series and the 2020 TV adaptation of Snowpiercer. In Ranger, the towering 6'5" Ponovich played one of the game's main villains, a hardened terrorist from Eastern Europe. Jeffrey C. Robertson, the stuntman known for his work on the CW Arrowverse shows, served as Liam McIntyre's main stunt double. Throughout 2013, Robinson joined a number of stunt performers as they filmed in enormous motion capture labs rented out to Black Tusk at some expense. This included EA Canada's studio, a large volume designed to capture games of football for the FIFA series. For some of its action set pieces, Black Tusk intended for the player to guide Cole through a series of parkour maneuvers, as he for instance leapt across rooftops in pursuit of an escaping enemy or fled a building on the verge of collapse. The developers purposefully hired multiple stunt performers with varying degrees of parkour skill to run through a series of elaborate obstacle courses. By capturing parkour runs at different levels of competency, this allowed them to create a parkour animation system that would dynamically mirror the skill of players. If a player's timing was off, animations based off a less adept parkour performer would be triggered. Likewise, if they landed a jump perfectly, or even just reasonably well, they'd see Cole's moves reflect that. With high-budget methods such as these, Ranger was intended to provide a graphical showcase for the Xbox One. The team had blocked out a number of potential scenarios for the game's missions that employed experimental and ambitious new technology built in-house. In one of these, described as impressive by ex-workers, the player navigated a tsunami-swept city based on Honolulu. As buildings were torn apart in the disaster, the demo rendered the environmental destruction in real time and simulated water that reacted to chunks of debris crumbling into it. In our conversations, sources often characterize some of the animation techniques being used as groundbreaking, with one former employee saying, quote, "It was borderline crazy, but really interesting tech, the way that we were manipulating animation data and runtime," end quote. By September of 2013, Black Tusk had produced a playable demo for Microsoft's leadership to illustrate their hopes for the project. Proof of concept videos were also made, one of which demonstrated a drone gadget that the player would have deployed for reconnaissance purposes. Taking place in a first-person view, Cole would comment on anything of interest observed by the player as they scouted out the mission area. Microsoft's execs are said to have praised this and some of their other ideas, but believed that Ranger's strengths lied in its gunplay mechanics rather than its gadgets. Publicly, Phil Spencer referenced this studio visit in a tweet from the 8th of September 2013. He followed up 2 days later in response to a fan saying, quote, "Collaboration between Black Tusk and Microsoft Research is leading to very interesting gameplay mechanics. Gameplay is looking great." Despite these comments, feedback from Microsoft executives led to Ranger undergoing a notable shift in direction around this time. Its emphasis on gadgets was dialed back, with their creative leads choosing to instead hone in on its combat. Many of the gadgets mapped out previously like the Fly were abandoned outright as a result. In making this turn, the project was effectively reined in to be more like Uncharted, as Microsoft's execs had once expressed a desire for. A developer who was involved at this juncture had this to say, quote, "The creative leadership on the project never really had a cohesive vision for the game. I think they mostly changed it because they felt their shooting/combat gameplay was strongest, so they wanted to lean in on it. While some felt that this was a change for the better, others feared that the game risked being derivative." In a prime example of how deep its Uncharted influence ran, some connected to the project recall playing what they derisively dubbed the Uncharted game, which consisted of counting how many times Sony's series would be cited during meetings. The answer supposedly was often a lot. In fact, some earlier internal mock-ups for the gameplay had even lifted the HUD from Uncharted wholesale. A more prominent concern among staff, however, was the project's lack of direction. After a year and a half in pre-production, Black Tusk had meandered, experimenting with and abandoning concepts left and right. A certain amount of this during the ideation period was not out of the ordinary, but with Ranger expected to enter full production in early 2014, some were worried that a solid direction still eluded them. Even something as simple as the main character's design was constantly in flux, flipping from having him in the black stealth suit, to at one point a purple coat, to eventually a dark leather jacket. One of these concerned parties had this to say, Quote, "I will say that no one seemed to know what they were doing, and by no one, I mean no one. I would include myself in that description. Everything changed constantly because everything was based on nothing. I was told that Ranger was James Bond meets Mission Impossible. To me, those two franchises are diametrically opposed, which should have been a big red flag. The only through line is they're based on spies." An ex-staffer associated with the game's story team, meanwhile, recounted their issues with the project's creative director, Chuck O'Shea. Quote, "Creative director was not creative or a director. I liked him a lot as a person, great guy, but totally out of his depth, constantly shifting goals or ideas based on a movie or something he'd watched." End quote. In another scathing statement, this same source criticized the management of Black Tusk for spending large sums of money, apparently well into six figures, on detailed cutscenes before the game's direction had been set in stone. Quote, "Writing team was writing and shooting actual cinematics for the vertical slice, which is wild given how expensive that is, literally throwing away work because again the constant changes. Endemic in AAA games over the past 15 years, worse every year. This sort of thing is commonplace, hence all the disastrous games coming out the past 3 years." A former employee who was a part of creating these cinematics offered a somewhat different perspective, however. Quote, "I can see why someone would say that, and I kind of concur with them, but game development is messy, there's a lot of moving parts, and I don't think I've ever been a part of any game where that wasn't the case. It was hamstrung slightly by the game loop and universe not being defined as early as probably would have been ideal. I think that's probably what people were reacting to. The problem is you have to spend that money. You have to get that train moving because motion capture and cinematics take so long that you've got to start dragging those carriages. You've got to start moving them and get them up to speed even though you don't know which train stop you're getting off at. You've got to get going. It takes a long time for all of that stuff to spin up." Apprehensions about the project's unfocused nature were not helped, sources told me, when the prospect of introducing time travel to the story was floated by its creative leads. Some developers had believed that the game's identity as a gritty and relatively grounded shooter had been settled when the prospect of a MacGuffin allowing the characters to rewrite history was brought up during meetings. For example, if Cole escaped a collapsing skyscraper or another disaster in one sequence, upon activating this device, he could leap back in time and undo it. Former workers told me that this was raised as a way for them to have their cake and eat it narratively, plunging the player into an exciting and destructive scenario without being burdened with its consequences to the game's larger world. In spite of recurring conversations around this concept, it was never implemented. To manage the project's group of writers and pull together their various ideas, Microsoft hired Armando Troisi as its narrative lead. He had previously served as lead cinematic director on Mass Effect 2 and narrative director on Halo 4. In spite of their efforts, the game's story and creative direction in general never fully congealed by all accounts. Quote, "The entire time we worked on that project, there wasn't a single reason why you'd want to move the character forward. The motivation was completely missing, and that's because there was no compelling justification for any of it." After checking in with Microsoft higher-ups in September 2013, Black Tusk began preparing a vertical slice for Ranger that they hoped would encapsulate its new direction and gave them the green light to move into full production. More missions were starting to be prototyped, such as a level where an undercover Cole would engage in a firefight at a Moscow metro station. It was at this point, when the game was slowly gaining some traction, that external politics threatened their plans. Not long after their September meeting, Microsoft's management ended discussions with Epic Games to acquire the rights to Gears of War. The series had become a pillar of the Xbox portfolio throughout the Xbox 360 generation, and Microsoft aimed to ensure that continued. Since Epic themselves wanted to move on to other ventures after 2013's Gears of War Judgment, Microsoft intended to purchase the IP and have one of their own studios develop the next game internally, an initiative said to have been spearheaded by Phil Spencer himself. In October 2013, certain staff at Black Tusk learned about the negotiations and that Spencer had aspirations of placing them in charge of Gears of War. The studio had been eyed by Microsoft's leadership to take over the series for a number of reasons. By this point, Black Tusk had grown to around 100 employees, many of whom had experience with AAA games. Since 2012, this group had been developing a third-person duck-and-cover action shooter in Unreal Engine 4, and the strongest aspect of that project that they had identified was its shooting mechanics. All of this, in their eyes, made them an ideal candidate to take on Gears. Such an outcome would spell the end of Ranger altogether, but the final decision was apparently left to the heads of Black Tusk. Although it would be months before the call would be made, some former staffers say the writing was on the wall long before this. One ex-employee claimed that Ranger's demise was presented to them as a certainty in October 2013, much to their disappointment. This same source asserted that their work on it was used by Phil Spencer in particular to sell Microsoft's heads on effectively cancelling it. Disillusioned by this turn of events, they and others chose to leave the studio shortly thereafter, telling me that another Gears of War title was much less interesting to them than the original IP they had been building. Its fate wasn't settled officially, however, until the start of 2014. While a number of staff knew about the acquisition and its implications for Ranger ahead of time, many were not informed until the week of January 20th, 2014. It was at this time that a group of senior Black Tusk members gathered to deliberate on the studio's future. According to studio manager Mike Crump, they reached a unanimous decision to shut down Project Ranger in favour of taking on Gears of War. The move proved divisive when it was disclosed to Black Tusk's wider team later that week. Whereas some relished the new opportunity ahead of them, others dismayed over the project's termination, a fact Mike Crump acknowledged during a 2014 interview with Polygon. Quote, "I'd be lying if I said there weren't some people on the team who were disappointed when they found out the thing they'd been working on for so long was going to be shelved. If you've been in the game industry long enough, you're going to go through project cancellations. People go through this period of mourning a bit. You have to give them that space and time to go through that, the sense of loss that people have around something they're invested in." End quote. Following its demise, a number of workers once attached to Ranger were let go as the company was reorganized for the task ahead. Rod Ferguson, a producer who had worked on each previous Gears of War game, was hired as studio head to lead them into this new era. In keeping with their new direction, they made the decision to rename the studio in 2015 to the Coalition, a reference to a faction from the Gears of War universe. Ranger's two leads, creative director Chuck O'Shea and lead designer Matthew Searcy, would maintain their positions on Gears of War 4. O'Shea later resigned from the Coalition in March 2017 due to health issues. By the end of development, Black Tusk had been on the verge of completing a vertical slice to embody their new direction for it. A gritty, linear third-person shooter with the occasional stretch of platforming and parkour during action set pieces. It was originally targeting a late 2015 launch and was discontinued shortly before Microsoft would have determined if it would proceed into production. One former member of the team reflected on the decision and the situation Black Tusk faced at the time, saying, quote, "I remember feeling like it was very ambitious, maybe a little too ambitious for the age of the team. The team was relatively new working together. A lot of experienced people, but new at working together. It takes a bit of time to gel. This is why, flipping it back to Gears, that I thought this is actually a good idea, to have something with an already well-grounded, well-described universe, and to just push that thing out, just get that done. It's a known quantity, and that's what they ended up doing, which I think was probably the right decision. I think Ranger probably shouldn't have been a new studio's first game. It would have been probably better suited to being a second or third game." Although the game was scrapped, many of the breakthroughs made during its development informed the creation of Gears of War 4. The Coalition retained a lot of technology created for Ranger, including its dynamic animation system and wind tech originally designed for its Tsunami demo. Its advanced water rendering was also under consideration for Gears 4's campaign, but was ultimately left unused. In a similar fashion, the Coalition employed the services of many of the people they had partnered with during Ranger, including its lead actor Liam McIntyre. After his performance as Agent Cole, McIntyre was rehired to play JD Phoenix, one of the main characters in Gears of War 4 and the son of Marcus Phoenix, the protagonist from the original Gears of War trilogy. Sources involved in the process claimed that this decision was made at least partly because Microsoft had already negotiated McIntyre's likeness rights. Earlier designs for JD more closely resembled McIntyre before their character models were revised to be closer to the bulky style of previous Gears games. Alex Ponovich, who once played a villain in Ranger, was also brought back to do motion capture work on Gears of War Ultimate Edition and Gears of War 4. Not everything that the coalition assumed from its predecessor was to their benefit, however. Former employees say that the studio inherited a problematic workplace dynamic that had been cemented during the days of Black Tusk, in which contract workers were treated as less valuable than those in permanent positions. Here's how this was described by someone who once worked there as a full-time member of staff. Quote, "I maintain that the studio's biggest failure was not the game getting cancelled, but the fractured culture that was created very early on and continued into the coalition. There was a very clear delineation between staff and temporary full-time workers. An example of that was during an all-hands Christmas meeting in front of everyone, they excitedly announced that the Xbox Ones and Microsoft phones were on their way. These, of course, were for staff only and not for temporary full-time workers." There couldn't have been a more clear line drawn between the two classes of employees. It was constantly there, poisoning every interaction. From my perspective, the temporary full-time people actually did the work, while the staff just theorized. I can't tell you the amount of times that during a critical pillar delivery, staff would straight up go on vacation." End quote. In lieu of Ranger, Microsoft co-funded Rise of the Tomb Raider with Square Enix, resulting in it being a timed Xbox One exclusive when it launched in November 2015. In an interview with Eurogamer from August 2014, Phil Spencer talked about this arrangement and gave some insight into the reasoning behind it. Quote, "I'm a big fan of Uncharted and I wish we had an action-adventure game of that ilk. We've started some and we've looked at them, but we don't have one today of that quality. This is an opportunity." Crystal has been investing in that game, and Square has as well, in Tomb Raider as a franchise, and wanting to put that at the highest level with the big AAA franchises out there, but that's expensive. For us, as we've been working together on this, it's a nice franchise for us in terms of the genre and how it fits into our first-party portfolio. Do I wish I had an owned IP first-party action-adventure game? Absolutely, but I don't right now. This is one that fits well, and we had such a good working relationship with them." End quote. Another game that attempted to fill this gap followed in 2016, an original property published by Microsoft and developed by Remedy Entertainment called Quantum Break. Microsoft sources told me that this project was the outcome of the same 2012 initiative from which Ranger originated, as they searched for a third-person shooter to rival Uncharted. This is not the first time that I've brought to light this derivative approach from Xbox executives. In 2014, they tried to ape another Sony franchise when they asked Capcom Vancouver to reboot the Dead Rising series as a gritty quote-unquote Last of Us killer. The result, which I covered in my video on the history of Capcom's Dead Rising studio, was a disaster that wasted considerable resources and led to several senior members of staff being fired. Project Ranger provides another example of the often rudderless nature of Xbox. It was greenlit in the hope of giving Microsoft its own Uncharted, and because it titillated an executive-level fascination with Kinect. Over time, their interest in the peripheral faded, and eventually so did their commitment to Ranger. Attempts to break from its Uncharted-like mandate were met with resistance from Spencer and his ilk, and while Black Tusk was in the middle of bending to meet their specifications, the same higher-ups determined that they should work on something else entirely. Microsoft Vancouver, or Black Tusk, or the Coalition, had to evolve with the whims of Microsoft's executives as ever. With all of that said, what about Phil Spencer's statements that I mentioned at the start of this video, in which he downplayed Black Tusk's project as more of a concept piece than a game? Was there any truth to that? I could reiterate the fact that the teaser shown at E3 was based upon a real mission they were building for the game, which was prototyped extensively. I could mention the costly cinematics Microsoft allowed them to create for it, how they had an entire team of writers crafting its story, or how they signed on a known actor to play its main character. But let's instead take a look back at some public statements made by Black Tusk itself. For a start, here's a reminder of what then studio manager Mike Crump told the Vancouver Sun in November 2012. Quote, "We are working on Microsoft's next big entertainment franchise. We're not working on an existing franchise, we're looking to build the next Halo here in Vancouver." He went on to say, "We have been officially greenlit by Microsoft executives to go ahead with the project that we're on. That's the way game development works. It's just like making a movie. You go through pitching and concepting, and then at some point you have a very large meeting with the executive team and present your full pitch with the business plan, and you get the green light. So that's happened for us." End quote. The homepage on Black Tusk's official website at the time included an introduction which read, "Do you want to help define Microsoft's next big entertainment franchise? Let's talk." In August 2013, an official Microsoft recruitment page on Twitter posted the following. Who is Black Tusk? Their first project is a highly ambitious, all-original new IP. When the news of the Gears acquisition broke in January 2014, the account responded to a fan inquiring about this original IP, saying, quote, "Black Tusk has been working on an all-original IP since its inception. We've just brought the Gears of War franchise into our portfolio and have not yet determined the future of the new IP at this point." End quote. One of the job openings this account once shared was for a lead writer position at Black Tusk, which specified the following, quote, "We are looking for a seasoned storyteller who can help us bring Microsoft's next big IP to life. This individual will help us develop the characters, story arc, emotional tone, pacing, dialogue, and flavor of a story that will shape the spirit of this new franchise." The duties listed for this role specified that they would collaborate and liaise with external narrative teams on transmedia opportunities for the franchise. It's clear then that in addition to being thought of as a potential franchise, they were even looking to expand Ranger beyond the realm of video games. Later, in the aftermath of its cancellation, Mike Crump spoke to Polygon, where he said the following, quote, "I'd be lying if I said there weren't some people on the team who were disappointed when they found out the thing they'd been working on for so long was going to be shelved. We were hugely invested in what we were working on. You don't spend a year and a half working on a game without getting attached to it. There was a lot of discussion." With that in mind, let's take a look at what Phil Spencer told GameIndustry.biz days after Ranger being, in the words of Mike Crump himself, shelved. Quote, "I wouldn't say things have been shelved. Obviously Gears will become a big focus of the studio and something that will be critical to them driving forward. There's not really something that was on the roadmap that all of a sudden goes away." End quote. Ranger as a project was evidently troubled, but there was inarguably a lot more to it than Spencer suggested. Almost any public statement on the project from his own company contradicts his claims made about it after the fact. Even he himself told a fan in July 2013 that they were working on a new IP. Then, just a few months before it was scrapped, he said it was sporting some very interesting gameplay mechanics, and that gameplay is looking great. Not only did Spencer avoid admitting that there was a real game that had been cancelled, he was also evasive on whether or not it could return. Even though there was practically zero chance of that happening, his language was distinctly non-committal about it any time a fan asked. It's not hard in retrospect to understand why he made the pivot that he did, given his role in orchestrating its cancellation. It was more advantageous for him and his company to downplay the work of their own developers legally prevented from speaking out, rather than risk upsetting fans. The complicated truth behind Ranger is that it was very much a real game that plenty of developers were genuinely invested in. A lot of work had gone into it, it was on the verge of entering full production, and some people even chose to leave the company altogether when it was axed. But at the same time, whether or not it would have actually seen the light of day will remain up for debate. I'll end with a quote from a former developer who offered their take on Spencer's comments and what might have been had it continued. "It was definitely meant to be a real game. It was described to me as Microsoft's version of Uncharted, but the game was never on sure footing. I've worked on a lot of games, and after a while you can tell straight away when a project is going to get canned. I knew as soon as I started working on it that if it was ever going to ship, it would have taken at least 5 more years. The guys in charge of it didn't really have a vision for the experience the game was, and they were just stumbling around hoping they could come up with something that felt right." Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more videos just like this one. If you'd like to support my work and allow me to keep making more of these, check me out on Patreon at patreon.com/Liam Robertson, just like these kind people did.